Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a 2017 study by Horat et al. Called Impaired Social Cognition in Schizophrenia During the Ultimatum Game and EEG Study. So social cognition is the term that we use to refer to the mental processes that we use for engaging with others in social interactions. Impairment in social cognition is considered a major symptom of schizophrenia. Prior to the current study, some studies had shown that social cognitive impairment can be found in schizophrenia during the prodromal stage and can also be an indicator of functional outcomes, so that's important. Previous research studying social cognition and schizophrenia has mostly been behavioral in nature and has used the ultimatum game paradigm. So the ultimatum game is when you have two people, one's the proposer, one's the responder. The object of the game for both of them is to acquire as much cash as possible, and the proposer has a certain amount, and they have to offer the responder some, and they can decide how much to offer, and the responder can accept or reject the offer. But if they reject the offer, then neither of them get cash, and this is a really interesting way for researchers to study social decision making because it brings in concepts like altruistic punishment and all kinds of stuff like that. So the behavioral studies mentioned that I mentioned showed that overall people with schizophrenia accepted more unfair offers than controls and rejected more fair offers than controls. Other previous research used EEG methods to study participants in the ultimatum game, but they didn't do it with schizophrenic populations. But these EEG studies found a component for responders called the an ERP, called the feedback-related negativity component, or the FRN. This component occurs about 320 to 360 milliseconds after stimulus onset and is thought to reflect the participants' evaluation of outcomes. So, for example, an unfair offer produces a larger FRN usually. So this previous research led the researchers of the current study to want to pursue a similar paradigm with the EEG and the ultimatum game, except with clinical schizophrenic population group and a healthy control group. So researchers hypothesized that schizophrenic participants in the responder condition would have decreased FRN amplitudes relative to healthy control participants in the responder condition. And they were also interested in a P2 component, but due to the time constraints of the presentation and the relative insignificance of that component compared to the FRN, I'm not really going to talk about that here. So focusing on the EEG aspect of their methods, researchers used caps with 128 active electrodes. CZ was their primary reference electrode, and to produce an ERP, researchers averaged EEG signals within a 700 millisecond time frame, including 200 milliseconds before the stimulus. ERP analysis was only performed using FPZ, FZ, FZ, FCZ, and CZ electrodes because this grouping has a frontocentral maximum. This was appropriate to investigate the research question for a couple reasons. So, firstly, those electrodes looked at the area in question because social decision-making processes have been found to occur primarily in the prefrontal cortex. Secondly, an EEG methodology allowed these researchers to look at the social decision-making within schizophrenic patients with an unprecedented temporal specificity that other people hadn't looked at before. The results of the study were significantly in favor of the researchers' hypothesis. Schizophrenic patients in the responder condition were found to have decreased FRN components compared to healthy control responders. No significant differences were found in the proposer condition, and there was also a significant negative correlation with FRN amplitudes and social cognition scores within the schizophrenic group. So these results add to previous literature because, as I mentioned, previous research involving schizophrenic patients and the ultimatum game was only behavioral. So studying the social decision-making of schizophrenic patients with the ultimatum game with this EEG methodology allowed researchers to highlight key differences in the timing of cognitive processes involved between schizophrenic patients and healthy controls. And I would say that overall it supports previous research because it adds more pieces to the puzzle, and it just kind of offers, it generates further possible explanations and hypotheses for the results of previous behavioral studies. like the data that they got, and social cognitive impairment and schizophrenia overall. So, like one thing that the researchers suggested was that since there was a difference in the responder condition, but not in the proposer condition, that maybe that shows the social cognitive impairment within schizophrenia is more of an impairment with interpreting social data rather than like anticipating it. Like they can anticipate it and like kind of engage in it, but if someone else is directing at them, like they have a hard time interpreting that. So this study also had some significant anatomical correlations. Researchers did a reconstruction analysis and found that within the schizophrenic group, the FRN component was likely to be coming from activity within the medial prefrontal cortex and the medial part of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So the MPFC is involved in decision making, reasoning, social cognition, and empathy. And the MDL-PFC is involved in emotional regulation. So abnormalities in both of those areas have been linked to schizophrenic patients, and the tasks that both of those brain regions are involved in, I think, are impactful for a lot of major symptoms that schizophrenic people have. And so to me, that shows that perhaps the mechanisms underlying schizophrenia and its symptoms could be very intertwined, and delving into that further could be perhaps a direction for future research. It's just interesting to me that like all those things come together in those areas where they have those deficits, and yeah. Another future direction for research could be preventative application of our knowledge of the social cognitive impairment present in schizophrenia. So as the researchers mentioned, this impairment can be a predictor of outcomes and could be present in the prodromal stage of schizophrenia. And if we could advance our study of this impairment and better understand its mechanisms, then maybe we could identify people with that impairment early on, see if they have those risk factors for developing schizotypal traits, and get them in touch with preventative care if possible so that they can have the best possible outcomes. Some limitations of the study that the researchers discussed was that they tried to control for other variables as much as they could, but there were variables within like education and especially within the schizophrenic group, like within different kinds of like treatments and stuff like that, different kinds of medications they were taking, etc. So for next time, if they were going to repeat the study, maybe having a more homogeneous control group and a more homogeneous clinical group would be helpful.